You're standing in a cave in what is now Spain, roughly 3,000 years ago. The air is thick with smoke. Around you, people are chanting. Their eyes are half closed. Someone has lit a bundle of plants in the corner, and the smell is sweet and heavy, like burned flowers mixed with pine. Your hands feel far away from your body. The walls of the cave seem to breathe. The painted animals on the stone, the deer, the horses, the strange half-human figures, they seem to move. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a question forms, slowly, like smoke rising. Did the people who painted these walls do exactly what you are doing right now? And if they did, how did they know which plants would open the mind and which ones would simply stop the heart? That's the question we're about to answer. Subscribe to The Buried Layer so you never miss one. Let's start with a fact that most people find genuinely surprising. The use of mind-altering plants is not a modern invention. It is not even an ancient invention. It may be one of the oldest human behaviors we can document. In 2019, a team of researchers, led by archaeologist Miriam Bouvet, published findings suggesting that complex ritual behavior, including the deliberate use of plants for non-food purposes, may stretch back over 50,000 years. That is before anatomically modern humans ever reached Europe. We were doing this before we built cities, before we invented writing, possibly before we had fully developed language. The oldest direct chemical evidence comes from a site called Shanidar Cave in Iraq. Excavated starting in 1951 by archaeologist Ralph Selecki, Shanidar Cave contained Neanderthal burials. Yes, Neanderthals, a completely different species from us. Pollen found in one of those graves suggested that flowers, possibly including medicinal or psychoactive plants, had been placed deliberately with the dead. The interpretation is debated. Some researchers argue the pollen came from burrowing animals, but the debate itself is important. It means scientists take the possibility seriously enough to argue about it. Moving forward in time, the evidence becomes far harder to dismiss. In 2020, a study published in the journal Scientific Reports documented the earliest confirmed use of a psychoactive substance by humans. Researchers analyzed residue found in a ritual cave on the island of Minorca in Spain. The residue contained alkaloids. These are naturally occurring chemicals in plants that affect the brain from multiple plants, including ephedra, which speeds up the heart and creates intense alertness, and scopolamine, which causes hallucinations. The study was led by researcher Elisa Guerra-Doce, an expert in prehistoric drug use at the University of Valladolid. The date of the residue was approximately 3,000 years ago, matching exactly the Bronze Age period when the cave was in active ritual use. But how did ancient people figure out which plants were safe and which were deadly? This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. The answer, according to researchers like ethnobotanist Wade Davis of the National Geographic Society, is something called empirical knowledge. Empirical means knowledge gained by doing and watching, not by reading. Ancient humans were extraordinary observers of the natural world. They watched animals. They noticed which plants birds avoided. They saw which berries made deer stumble or act strangely, and they experimented cautiously, communally, over generations. Here is something important to understand. When a plant kills you, you do not pass that knowledge on. But when a plant makes you feel strange and you survive, you tell everyone. Communities built what researchers call ethnopharmacological knowledge. That is a long word, so let's break it down. Ethno means culture or people. Pharmacological means related to drugs or medicine. So ethnopharmacological knowledge is simply the knowledge a community builds up over time about how plants affect the human body. This knowledge was carefully guarded, carefully tested, and carefully passed down, usually through specialists we might call shamans. The shaman found in cultures across Siberia, the Americas, Africa, and Asia was essentially a professional at navigating altered states. Anthropologist Mircea Eliade, in his landmark 1951 book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, documented how these specialists spent years learning which plants to use, in what amounts, combined with what rituals, in what physical conditions. Getting it wrong meant death. Getting it right meant the community believed you could speak to spirits, heal the sick, and find lost animals. The stakes created enormous pressure to be careful. A shaman who poisoned someone did not get a second chance. The community remembered. The knowledge that survived was the knowledge that worked, tested not in a laboratory, but in the most serious laboratory that has ever existed, real life, with real consequences. But here's where it gets unsettling. The margin for error was razor thin. Many of the plants ancient humans used contain compounds that are poisonous in slightly larger doses. Datura, a plant used in rituals across North America, India, and ancient Greece, contains scopolamine and atropine. A small amount causes powerful visions. A slightly larger amount causes your heart to stop. Researchers studying the oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece, where a priestess called the Pythia delivered famous prophecies, now believe the trance she entered may have been caused by geological gases or plant preparations, possibly including datura. Archaeologist John Hale and geologist Yele de Boer published this theory in 2001, identifying ethylene gas seeping from rock fissures beneath the temple as a likely contributing factor. The Pythia sat directly above these fissures. Ancient Egyptians used blue water lily, also called Nymphaea caerulea. This plant contains aporphine, a mild psychoactive compound. Images of people holding or smelling these lilies appear repeatedly in Egyptian tomb paintings, some dating to 1350 BCE. A 2020 study published in the journal PLOS ONE confirmed the presence of psychoactive compounds in ancient Egyptian wine residue, suggesting that wine was sometimes mixed with blue lotus and other plant materials for ceremonial use. The ancient Vedic culture of India, which eventually gave rise to Hinduism, referred repeatedly in their oldest texts, the Rig Veda, written roughly 1500 BCE, to a ritual drink called soma. Scholars have debated for over a century what soma actually was. Theories include the Amanita muscaria mushroom, which causes hallucinations, the ephedra plant, or a fermented plant juice. The debate remains open. What is confirmed is that soma was central to ritual life and was consumed by priests in carefully controlled quantities. What is striking about all three of these examples, the Pythia, the Egyptian blue lotus, the Vedic soma, is how deliberate they were. These were not accidents. These were not people stumbling into strange experiences and not knowing what had happened. These were carefully designed rituals, built around specific substances, refined over generations, and placed at the very center of each culture's spiritual life. The substance was not the point. The experience, the substance made possible, was the point. But here's where it gets unsettling again. The use of these substances was almost never recreational. That matters enormously. Across virtually every ancient culture where psychoactive plant use has been documented, the substances were used inside a strict framework of ritual, community supervision, fasting, and preparation. Researchers call this a set and setting, the mental state you are in and the physical environment around you, and both were carefully controlled. The ayahuasca brew used by Amazonian peoples, containing the powerful compound DMT, was never just drunk casually. It was administered by a specialist, usually after days of dietary restriction, and always within a community container of singing, firelight, and guidance. Anthropologist Luis Eduardo Luna, who has studied ayahuasca practices for over 4 decades, documented this in his foundational 1986 research with the Vegetalistas of Peru. The sophistication of this knowledge is staggering. Ayahuasca requires 2 separate plants to work. The DMT-containing plant alone does nothing when you swallow it, because your stomach destroys it. But the vine Banisteriopsis caapi, brewed together with the leaves, contains compounds called MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which block your stomach from destroying the DMT. The result is a powerful, visionary experience. How ancient Amazonian people figured out to combine precisely these 2 plants, from among tens of thousands in the rainforest, without modern chemistry, is a question science has not fully answered. Ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes, who documented this in the 1950s and 60s, called it one of the most remarkable pharmacological discoveries in human history. Here is what this all means, and it is a conclusion most people avoid making because it forces a rethink of some very comfortable assumptions. We tend to believe that scientific knowledge, real, reliable, tested knowledge, is something that began with laboratories, universities, and written experiments. We imagine ancient people as lucky guessers who stumbled into useful discoveries by accident. The evidence about psychoactive plants destroys that assumption completely. What ancient cultures built over tens of thousands of years was a genuine scientific tradition. It was oral, not written. It was communal, not institutional, but it was rigorous. It was tested against real outcomes. People died when it was wrong and survived when it was right. The knowledge that remained was the knowledge that worked. This is, at its core, exactly what the scientific method does. The difference is the notebook. This has a direct implication for how we approach the human past. Every time we assume ancient people were primitive or ignorant, we erase an enormous library of tested knowledge about the natural world. Ethnobotanists, like Wade Davis, have spent careers documenting how many modern medicines, including treatments for cancer, heart disease, and mental illness, were derived from plants that indigenous communities had used for centuries or millennia. When a culture disappears, that library burns. And there is one final thought worth sitting with. Ancient humans managed to explore the most dangerous edges of human consciousness and build sustainable, careful, communal practices around it. Practices that survived for thousands of years. Today, with all our chemistry, all our neuroscience, all our institutional knowledge, we are still trying to figure out how to do the same thing responsibly. Maybe the lesson is not just what they discovered. Maybe the lesson is how they held it.